I agree, Barbara. It's been lovely. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you. Z, nice for you to join us this morning.
Miss C, are you in New York?
Yeah.
Okay. Glad to see you. This is Nell.
Is this your first time joining one of our Zoom something or others?
Yeah. This is I think it's the second time, right?
Good. Come back again. We're glad to have you. For those of you who don't know Z-Pay, she did her graduate work at postdoc work at Duke and then moved to a lab in New York. So after a stop in China. Did everybody have a quiet Thanksgiving, I imagine? Yeah.
I went to see Lily. It was not quiet.
Oh. It was your son and daughter-in-law and Lily, right?
Yeah, and her mother. So yeah.
Good. Nice.
We enjoyed a vegetarian Thanksgiving dinner, and we enjoyed it very much. But that was a little different take than I'm accustomed to. So we had tofurkey.
I was wondering if it was a tofurkey. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was the tofurkey roast with in a ball with a lot of delicious dressing in the middle, and it came with gravy and yeah, and many. I think our daughter and husband counted was it 20 vegetables that we had in the course of the meal in various shapes and forms.
Wow. It sounds like a delicious feast.
It really was.
Good. That's great.
We should go ahead and get started with class. We are very pleased this morning to hear from Michael Larbi. I think most of you already know him well from his leadership over the last couple of years that led to the formation of our Life Together groups. His topic is An Outsider's Reflections, Race, the Church, and Reconciliation in America. And as many of you know, he's well qualified to fulfill that title, as I'm not sure how many of the others of us have had the opportunity to worship on at least 4 different continents. So he's had experience with many different cultures on how they deal with this problem or do not. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Nelson. So let me share my screen and start. Tony, can you please make me a co-host so I can share?
There you go, sir.
Okay, so let me do that. So as Nelson said, my subject today is An Outsider's Reflections on Race, the Church, and Reconciliation in America. Now, as many of you know, I'm still a student at the Divinity School. I'm studying for an MDiv. So, and also I am very new to the American context. You know, the only time I've lived here is these past 2.5 years while I've been at Duke. So a lot of what I'm going to say is basically an outsider's view, literally. I'm still learning so much about what's happening in America, and there's such a long way to go. The topics I'll cover is just briefly my background. Then I'll also cover what I've learned about the American context. After that, I'll pause for some input from all of you, and then I'll share some reflections. In the reflections, I'll talk about who has influenced my thoughts some of my own reflections as I've been looking at the racial situation and all that has happened this summer and what I've learned while schooling at the Divinity School. And then I'll cover a few other reflections as well. So let me start by saying that I am Ghanaian British. So I was born and bred in Ghana in West Africa, but my adult life has all been in Britain. And I'm also an accredited local preacher in the Methodist Church in Britain. What this means is that I can preach in any Methodist church in the UK. I have the accreditation to do that. And part of that has been that I've preached in many churches, small and large, especially in London and the wider London area. And the experience has been interesting. You know, I've walked into so many situations where I'm the only Black person there. And sometimes it's a very interesting experience. I also served for 2 years in South Korea in a very large Methodist church. In doing this, I had to learn Korean as a language. I also had to pick up some Chinese and some Japanese as well. And learning all the multicultural contexts from that side of the world as well. I've participated in the Northeast Asia Reconciliation Institute, which is sort of led by the Duke Divinity Center for Reconciliation. So I've done that for 2 consecutive years. And I've learned a lot about the racial situations in Asia and how they are being dealt with, or as Nelson said, not being dealt with. And let me reiterate that I'm still learning about America. I thought I should show this slide because I think that what has become very heavily impressed on me especially in the last year, is how much history has a part to play in the situation in America. So one of the good things about the Divinity School is that at least all of us have to take something like a Black history, Black church history class before we graduate, you know, so at least for the Methodist track. So for that reason, this past semester, I've actually taken a class in Black church history. And a lot of the things you see on this slide have come from some of the things I learned from that. So I learned a lot about, and in addition to that, I've also taken 4 different classes over the past 2 years in world Christianity, talking about American missions around the world, and American as well as European missions around the world, and the interaction of Christianity with other cultures. One of my favorite professors is Professor Shilian, who has taught me a lot on this. And so in American context, sort of, I have today at the top of my of the chart on the left. But today is actually founded on such a deep foundation of many things that have happened historically in America. So in the 1830s, we had the Indian Removal Act, for instance, where Native Americans were actually relocated in different places. Slavery has gone on for about 400 years in America. Went on for about 400 years. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation happened in the 1860s. Then after the Civil War ended, we had Reconstruction, and then there was a lot of change in the South, and part of the change resulted in segregation as well, where people, you know, colored only and white only facilities and all that actually happened. And then there was a civil rights movement of the 1960s. So for all of you who are American, I'm sure this is just a repeat of everything you've learned in school or know already intimately. But for my own benefits, I think this is helpful to just go through. That there are some things, one of the reasons I did this slide is because there are some things that I have actually learned that, you know, are such a strong basis of where things are, where things are in America. So one of the first things is that there's a black and white divide in America. That's what I've seen. And historically, there are certain stereotypes, you know, that have existed. So for the white community, especially in the times of slavery, the question of the character and fitness of Black people, you know, even as equal citizens, or even their qualification to be converted to Christianity was in question. Then over time, even people like Thomas Jefferson, you know, cast doubt on the intellectual capacity of Black people. And there was a whole notion that Blacks had inferior intellectual capacity. Another thing also that has been part of the American history is that Blacks for a long time have been deemed to be innately religious. Now, that is not always seen in a positive light. You know, the thing about it is that religious has been equated to soft and humble. You know, in other words, they didn't have the guts, if I can use that expression, of competing at the rough and tumble business level, et cetera, et cetera. So these last two notions, particularly of inferior intellectual capacity and innate religiosity, you know, apparently has harmed the Black community quite a lot. On the Black side, because of things like slavery and all the things that have gone on, even during times of slavery and through the historical accounts that we've been studying, one of the things that has become clear is that it's a phrase I picked up in the divinity school called moral superiority. The sense that the Blacks are on the right side of morality, you know, and whites are on the wrong side of morality. So that also has colored the Black view of the situation as we have it. On this slide talks about the current or the contemporary themes and stereotypes that we hear and we see. So white supremacy is mentioned a lot. We hear a lot about white privilege, institutional racism, Black Lives Matter, anti-racism, all lives matter, systemic racism, economic deprivation, and the list goes on. And these are the things that contextually, this is what I'm learning, you know, that this is what is currently these are the stereotypes that we have. Going back to this slide paints a historical picture and why we've arrived where we are at. Because things like segregation were so clearly racist, you know, in today's world, apart from things like, you know, police brutality and things like what happened with George Floyd, it's not very easy to see clearly where racism is sometimes, you know. I mean, there's a notion that racism exists and we have all these terms to explain what we mean. But at the same time, it is not as black and white as it used to be with things like, if you excuse the pun, black and white as it used to be with things like segregation or slavery. You know, so now it's a lot more subtle. And these are some of the challenges we have in society today. And I think that because of that, racism seems to be more covert than overt today. And some of the solutions I've heard is that, you know, we should have a zero tolerance anti-racism, zero tolerance for racism. Everybody should acknowledge their own bias or racial bias. And with white people especially, I've also read papers and heard people say things like, you know, whites should acknowledge their guilt. And that seems to be such a big part of the push towards, I think when you look at things like white supremacy, white privilege, et cetera, the solution overall seems to be acknowledge your guilt, acknowledge that you're biased, etc.
Michael?
Yes.
And again, it's always tricky because we now live in such internet interwoven access to information, you know. I don't know if part of my comment is related to that versus the fact that because I learned more overt racism. I'm at least in the last 4 years, there have been situations that are on my next door neighbor or, you know, in WRAL news right after this current president, sitting president, was not able to denounce white supremacy very forcefully, that there was direct, I mean, slashing of a neighbor's tires on their business truck with pine needles saying the N-word, we did this to you. Anyway, I bring that out as it is more covert, but it seems, at least for me, I'm hearing distinct things that are very disturbing that are more overt again. So I'm challenged by that. So I really look forward to hearing your talk some more, but I guess I'm just wondering, it seems like the overt is becoming more overt recently.
Okay, I take your points. I think I'm coming at it from the point of view of the structures that existed in society before are no longer there. So sometimes it's a bit harder, it's a lot harder to detect or to see what's happening, which is racist. So somebody may live in a community where they never experienced the sort of event that you just described, and they may say, I'm not racist, and you hear a lot of that. So how do we deal with that? And so I think that there are more shades of gray now, if I can put it that way, than there used to be, where it used to be clearly the institutions were there, the structures were there was segregation, people were in different schools, etc., etc. And I think that we are in a more challenging phase as a result, because you can't always point to it and say this is racist. I mean, some things happen and we all say this is racist. George Floyd was one of those examples. Police brutality, we see a lot of it, and that is clearly racist. But otherwise, the ordinary person on the street who is just going about their daily lives, who's trying to make ends meet, who is doing their best to take their children through school, both black and white, are they racist? I mean, it's quite hard to paint that sometimes, I find. Any other comments before I go on? So I'll give you one or two examples as well. So, I mean, my context has been Duke. I've sort of lived virtually at Duke for 2.5 years and been on campus for most of that time, studying and going to classes and interacting with people. And one of the things, I mean, you hear comments, so I remember there was a time when we were in a group discussion, and one white lady was quite frustrated and saying she actually heard a sermon, or she was in a church context where someone was preaching about racism, and it was so hard. And the whole question that was put out was, I mean, her question was, someone just tell me what I should do and I would do it, okay? It's as if I said to these meetings that it's very hard for me to take all this because I don't know what exactly is expected of me. And I think that one thing that has happened with the George Floyd incident and the sudden reawakening of the public consciousness on these issues is that things like anti-racism are being explained a lot more, lack of tolerance for racial comments and things that people do that are clearly racist, whether it's in private or in public. There's a lot less tolerance for things like that today. I mean, this is my own observation, but I may be wrong. So, I mean, part of this is just a conversation, and I appreciate people just stepping in and giving any comments. So let me go on to my reflections. Some of the reflections I've had as I've thought about the race questions so far. The first reflection is that prejudice is not a unique American phenomenon. I mean, it's not something that is unique to America at all. I remember when I was growing up as a kid, I was living in Ghana, and even neighbors, I mean, I was from one tribe, another tribe, even our neighbors, sometimes you'd hear people make snide comments about people from other tribes. And in the Ghanaian context, you'd hear people from the north being denigrated very much in the south. And these are all black people. I'm not talking about whites and blacks. These are all the same colored people, same country. Presumably we share everything in common. But even in that context, there was a lot of prejudice. I went to boarding schools. And one of the things in places like Ghana which helped is that for middle school, all my middle school years were all in boarding school. I mean, we had people mixing from all races, and that actually helped. All tribes, different tribes. So around the world, prejudice is quite prevalent. And to me, it seems to be part of the human condition, that if you put two people in the same, or a few people in the same community for long enough, prejudice seems to develop somehow. And I've given 3 examples here. One of them is tribal prejudice. And I give the example of when I was in Ghana as a kid. I mean, we all know about the situation and what happened in Rwanda, where 2 tribes, all black people just killed each other, Tutsis and Hutus. And by the time it finished, we had a genocide of unimaginable proportions, apparently over 1 million people dead. Racial prejudice happens amongst white people as well. So I mentioned that I've lived in the UK. I mean, I'm British as well. And surprise, surprise, the United Kingdom is called United Kingdom because it's 4 nations which actually come together to make that kingdom. And within that, you have the English, people from Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And I mean, to me, these people don't always like each other. You know, if you hear some of the comments that are made by whites against whites in the same country, you know, and it's not as if they're different color. Of course, I mean, Black people in Britain have also had their own share of problems. You know, we've had, there was the history of slavery, and then it's gone on to other things. But even within white countries, like, I mean, predominantly white countries, between whites and whites, there's racism as well. In Asia, I mean, some of the things, I remember going to the Reconciliation Institute in 2019 and meeting people from Taiwan. And they talk about the fact that there are something like 15 ethnic groups in Taiwan. And people who came from the mainland China actually did a lot of horrible things against them and took over their land. You know, so there's a lot of bitterness there. And it's all, and you would think they all look Chinese, they're all Chinese, so what's the problem here? But even in that context, there's prejudice as well. Then there's class prejudice, you know, where it's like the rich against the poor. People don't want to marry out of their class, you know, and the class prejudice is very rife in places like Europe, you know. So one of the key point of this slide is that prejudice is not limited to America. Prejudice is not something that only Americans practice, you know. It is something that is universal, really. And it's not something that should be tolerated, but it's important for us to remember that we are not unique in this. Any questions, any comments, questions on this?
I'm really glad you mentioned this, Michael, because this is something I think about a lot. The recent news from Armenia, from Armenia and that area, where it's just clear that, you know, some folks who have lived side by side for hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years just seem to hate each other. And it's this inbred hatred that it makes me, sometimes it makes me despair about how can we ever get past that? How do you get past that? And so in some ways, what we witness in America is less ingrained because it's only a couple of 100 years, you know, 200, 300, 400 years old against the races here, as opposed to some of these tribal differences around the world. But I think it truly is part of the human condition. And so my question would be, how do we get past that? So thank you for bringing this up.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a few suggestions as to how we get past that as we go on. Reflections. Another reflection for me is culture versus strategy. So right now, a lot of the efforts on sort of combating racism seems to be centered around anti-racism, you know, zero tolerance, etc., which is all very well and good. But I think that one of the big things that is being ignored or not actually looked at a lot is culture. One of my sort of business heroes, you know, or business management heroes is Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker was someone who talked a lot about management, and he made the statement that, and he was talking in a business context and saying, culture eats strategy for lunch. You know, and I think this statement actually applies very much here, where we are making a lot of effort towards combating racism. But one of the things that we shouldn't ignore is what cultures exist in our society. So in America, there are multiple cultures. And the troubling thing is that cultures don't mix. Okay, so you have white culture, you have Black culture, and people are just comfortable in their own space. And it's very easy to sling mud across the fence to the other culture and say, oh, you are the reason why we have a problem, you know, or you are not being responsible enough for your own lots, etc. And the cultural situation is quite serious, I think. I think that one of the things that is important is that we should begin to appreciate and value our diversity. I don't see that happening a lot. You know, in 1 Corinthians 12, St. Paul talks about what is someone actually summarized as unity in diversity. He describes the whole body, a human body, and says, look, we need every part of the body. You need your hand, you need your finger, etc., etc. And all of us know this from experience. You know, if you have a cut finger, it can ruin your whole day. You know, it's just a little finger, but you are in trouble. And it's the same thing with what's happening here, where if a part of the society, one cultural context is suffering, everybody else suffers. You know, even if we don't realize that's what's happening. Appreciating our differences is quite important. And let me explain. One of the reasons why I think this is so important is because sometimes we tend to read things into situations because we don't fully appreciate how other people actually operate and how they think and how they behave. So I'll give you some broad generalizations here. So being African, of African descent as well, and having sort of also being British and knowing that all these contexts, one of the things that I realize is that Black people are generally very connect on an emotional level. You know, it's like how they feel loved and appreciated and everything is much more on an emotional level, and very much more, what's the expression? Tactile level, you know, where touch is important, the way you express, the way you show emotion and you react to things is quite important to a Black person, you know. On the other hand, in Britain, for instance, one of the complaints I've heard from my Black colleagues has been things like, oh, white people are so cold. You know, it's not about being cold, it's more about how are they conditioned and how do they think and how do they behave? So for white people in general, what I've found, and I found this through my career working for at least a couple of decades in many big companies as well, that things are appreciated at a more sort of visceral and intellectual level, you know, than showing emotion all the time, if you see what I mean. In Britain, for instance, one of the common expressions you'd hear is, oh, this person wears their feelings on their sleeves, right? Some cultures live that way. Some cultures function that way. Other cultures don't, you know, so showing a lot of emotion seems to be even interpreted as weakness. And I think that in America, we have a lot of that, you know. So in the Black community, when you see Black people interacting, it's very emotive, it's very interactive and all that. It's a lot more higher on energy than I see on the other side, you know, of the equation. It doesn't mean that any of them is right or wrong. It just means we actually do things differently. And that diversity is a rich diversity that we should appreciate. And I think that's one of the big things that I don't see being addressed much. We have to learn to cross that cultural divide. So another thing also is that sometimes I find that there's a lot of suspicion and fear of crossing into the other side, you know, and saying, actually, I want to live and interact with you. One person who is on the call today, I won't mention names, but actually mentioned this because I haven't asked the permission, but I think it's a good illustration where, going into a grocery shop, which is predominantly in a Black community, then this is a white person, and the interaction there is not always as sort of warm as you would expect, you know, mainly because they are not comfortable with you coming into our space. You know, without learning to actually cross these barriers, it's going to be difficult, I think, because we can't actually combat suspicion and fear without crossing cultural divides and appreciating that other people live and operate on a different level, in a different way. So loving each other without fear and suspicion is quite important. At our last retreat, Dr. Gottlieb talked about the fact that the antidote to racism is love. But I think that in practice, love becomes a lot more difficult if we all stay in our own silos. You know, so we have to find a way of crossing that divide. And part of it also has to do with being ready to give the benefit of the doubt. You know, so I remember being in the divinity school once. I'll share this because it was an open forum, lunchtime forum. And this lady came and was talking. This was a white lady explaining a lot about racism and stuff like that. And one black lady who is actually, she's actually graduated now, made the comment that, oh, white middle-aged women are dangerous. And then she went on, you know, and I was shocked to hear that, you know, because, I mean, without any explanation and all that, she just said that, and she went on. Later on, another colleague of mine, another mate of mine, who is a white lady, actually, told me that as soon as she heard that, she just closed out her mind to any conversation. She wasn't going to open up at all to discuss anything. So I don't know the context for why these sorts of statements are made, but I think that sometimes it's because of how we perceive that somebody has treated us, even in church, even in in a multicultural context. And we come out and we feel like, oh, I didn't feel welcome in that place, you know. And I think having a readiness to give each other the benefit of the doubt is such an important part of overcoming our racial divides, I think. I think I should pause here and ask you for your reactions to this.
Michael, I think you're right on with this. And I think, excuse me, one of the things that we as the American culture and maybe Western culture, which you might have a greater insight on having lived in Europe, we actually made it worse by one of the initial strategies that we used to combat racism was saying that all people are exactly the same. Not in the sense that we all have the same rights and all of things, but basically saying there is no white culture, there is no black culture, there is no Asian culture. We're all just people. If you say, or if you seem to notice, well, this type of attitude, whatever, these ideas are more prevalent among these type of people, that's racism. And it really isn't. That's culture, which is not the same as racism. To be able to realize, obviously, there are differences, but they are not inherently better or worse, superior or inferior. That's the difference. And I remember growing up being taught that, you know, there is no culture, which is ridiculous. But that, I think we actually tended to make it worse by ignoring what you're talking about here.
Yeah. Thank you, Carl. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this was a difficult slide to prepare because I don't want people to think that I'm trying to say, I mean, that we are not equal. That's not the point at all. It's just that right. We see things differently. I mean, yes. I mean, when I'm in London, I live quite differently from when I go back to Ghana, for instance. You know, so I'll give you one example. So in Ghanaian culture, for instance, any family member, extended family member, can come and visit you. Okay. And they just turn up, no questions asked, and stay for as long as they want. Okay, you are in big trouble. You know, it's like, how could you do that? Now, I remember my family going to visit an old family friend, another family in Oxford, in England, and we turned up unannounced, and they just went into a tizzy, you know, because they just didn't know what to do with themselves. You know, how do we entertain? You know, what are we going to do? And I mean, they rallied their spirits and found us lunch and all that. But it was so funny. I mean, later when we thought about it, because it was like, you have to give them notice. They have to prepare. They have to feel like we are serving our guests well. It had nothing to do with they were not welcoming people. You know, so appreciating that people operate in different ways, you know, based on how they've been brought up and all that. And it's not about right or wrong, about not being equal and all that. It's quite an important part of it. And what I find is that in America, there isn't a lot of tolerance for that today. And I think that's part of the problem, actually.
In addition to our actions, our words can, I guess I'd encourage us to guard against generalizations. They're, you know, things as innocent as saying all redheads are hot-headed or hot-tempered or something. And, you know, people who say that are other things that they, you know, figures of speech they've heard for decades in their life. When that's said in the presence of a redhead or you know, somebody that maybe that individual who's speaking has had very little experience with, just like your earlier anecdote, the person who hears it fears that that is the tip of a big iceberg rather than just a revealing momentary ignorance.
Thank you, Delson. Another point that is actually very well made. Thank you. I mean, I made a broad generalization here. Let me just clarify. But I thought I had to illustrate this somehow, and that's why I used that illustration. But that's at the bottom line is we are diverse. We should celebrate that. We shouldn't look at that as inherently wrong, you know, because we can't be the same. You know, that's just not human either. Another reflection is from Martin Luther King, actually. This is my colleague Matt Wright, who is also on the staff of the congregation with me, shared this at a congregation staff meeting. And I was so impressed with it that I thought I would share it today. So Martin Luther King wrote a book called Strength to Love. And he gave 3 options as to how you deal with the sort of situation we have in America. He said, you can have a tough mind is important. I mean, you can have a tough mind, and a tough mind means incisive thinking, realistic appraisal, decisive judgment. In other words, whatever is happening around us, we shouldn't just take it for a fact. You know, it's even when a well-known scholar has written something, we should be prepared to challenge it. You know, think about it. Is this really true? Is this something that actually works well for us, for our society, etc.? But he said, Martin Luther King, MLK also said that by itself, that can also lead to a cold heart, where every time you look at everything with just, you know, I have to reason all this out before I can figure it out and I can work with it. And eventually, when you only work at the intellectual level, it can lead to violence and bitterness, you know, where it's like, you know, you're always looking at things in a very hard way. A soft mind, on the other hand, is one that's sort of just fears change and doesn't want to, I mean, just has security in the status quo, doesn't want to change anything. You know, they're complacent with what's happening now. But what he proposes is that we should have a tough mind and a tender heart. You know, by that it means that God is both tough-minded and God is tender-hearted. He used the example of Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. You know, and for him, this was the basis for the whole non-violent resistance to racism in his time. And I think that motif is quite, I like that very much, because what it means is that we should challenge things. You know, we shouldn't be afraid to challenge things. I mean, what I'm doing this morning is actually trying to do that, you know, which is saying, yes, these are the things that we accept. We talk about equality, but equality is not cultural equality because our cultures are different, you know, even though we live in the same country, that type of thing. And I'm happy for you to challenge that as well. That is quite an important part of working through the challenges we have to arrive at solutions that work. At the same time, too, we should be tender-hearted towards each other. I mean, you can't cross cultural divides if you're always judging the other person, or for whatever reason. You know, the love should be genuine, and this is a very Christian thing, you know, where love transcends a lot of things. I mean, perfect love casts out fear. You know, love covers a multitude of sins. You know, as Christians, we can quote all these Bible passages, but that's all about being careful to be tender-hearted towards the other person, irrespective of race or color or whatever. Let me cover this one as well. So another thing also is about the role of the church. What I've found through studying at the Divinity School and reading up and all that is that the church sometimes has been complicit in racism, you know. So in the racial period, in the times of slavery, etc., the church wasn't always supportive of those enslaved. You know, it was a complex situation where, you know, the church had to make a case in some cases for slaves to even be allowed to worship, to be converted to Christianity. You know, it wasn't a very easy thing because slave masters were more interested in slaves just doing their work, you know, and meeting their quota, that type of thing. Sometimes the church has led in combating racism as well. You know, it's not always been being on the compromising side. The other challenge we have as a church is also that even our own theological thoughts is not uniform. We have, one of the big challenges we have in America today is the whole liberal conservative divide, and a lot of that is underpinned by church theology as well. So having said all that, I think that it's important to emphasize that Christians and the church have a huge role to play here. And I picked up a lot from one book we read in class, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was in the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the first thing to say is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was led by Christians, Archbishop Tutu himself. His vice chair was a former Methodist Church conference president, Dr. Boroin. And there were other faith leaders, there were Hindus, there were, etc. involved. At one point, Desmond Tutu even told the commission, do you mind if I appear in my Archbishop, cassock and everything? And they said, we wouldn't have it any other way, And the whole Truth and Reconciliation thing, if you like, was if you compare it to the American historical context, was happening at a time where they had just come out of apartheid and they were going into a democratic governance, which allowed all the Black people to vote as well. So it was a very, very sort of tender period where things would go anyway. There could be a lot of violence, there could be war, there could be civil war, etc., etc. But in the middle of all this, I wanted to point out to you the role that the church played a bit more. So Desmond Tutu's book is titled No Future Without Forgiveness. And one of the first things he says is that the witness and the ministry of the church has been something of a mixed bag, okay, which is very similar to what's happening in America, where he was saying that the church used the Bible to justify apartheid, segregation, okay, that on the one hand. On the other hand, the church was teaching things like, love your neighbors yourself, and so how do you reconcile all that? In spite of that, Desmond Tutu makes the point that forgiveness, confession, reconciliation were far more at home in the religious dialogue than in the political discourse. And I think that's a very important point. In the church, we come to church every Sunday, we confess our sins. Things about confession, forgiving other people and all that, this is part of our DNA as a church. We understand that language, we understand that way of thinking. People outside the church, people who are not Christians, don't necessarily think this way at all. And Desmond Tutu's point was that the church can actually help society to appreciate these things, can help society to understand these things a lot more. So he gives examples. So Mandela, after 27 years in jail, he says, was the embodiment of reconciliation and forgiveness. He was a political prisoner for 27 years. But when he came out, he wasn't bitter. He was looking for reconciliation and then forgiveness. He was not someone who was vindictive, hell-bent on paying back the whites with their own coin, etc. Another thing is that, Desmond Tutu also says that Mandela must have perceived that the work of reconciliation will be profoundly spiritual. And if the church can't do spiritual work, then we're in trouble, a lot of what's happening in America is very spiritual as well. And this is a domain of the church. And there are two other concepts he mentioned. One of them is restorative justice, where what happens if someone has wronged you? What happens if someone has been racially brutal, etc., etc.? How do we go about things? He talks about the restorative justice versus punitive justice. So the whole notion that the healing of breaches, redressing of imbalances, restoration of broken relationships is the kind of justice where we are looking to not just punish someone, but actually heal the society as well. And so that our work as Christians must involve that seeking for restorative justice. And then he makes the point that God has a particularly soft spot for sinners. We can never give up on anyone. And that is something that I think is quite important. When we think that even the worst racist is loved by God, even the worst white supremacist is loved by God as well. And this is where the church can actually come in and help society to understand some of these things. And as Christians, we can embody that in our day-to-day living. one thing you mentioned, and I've heard this debate a bit here about reparations. We should pay blacks for slavery, etc., etc. And Desmond Tutu was saying that even in South Africa, the money that was paid to families and things like that could never compensate for the suffering. Okay, it was more of a symbolic gesture to say the nation actually recognized that you've gone through this and we are with you, essentially. So these are some of the points that he covers. I mean, it's an amazing book, and I highly recommend it, because I think there's so many parallels between that and what's happening in America. And what I want to say about this is that it's not just down to the leaders like Desmond Tutu, it's down to all of us, where we can begin to embody God's love in our societies, Okay, so before I finish this one of the things I should say is that in terms of crossing barriers, in terms of all the things we are talking about, a big part of it has to be our willingness to just be loving and friendly, and just stepping out of our comfort zones into places where we have not gone before. And I'm talking about blacks and whites. I'm not talking about only sort of white people doing it in black communities. And I'm not talking about doing something that is charitable. I'm talking about something quite radical. I'll give an example. So what will happen if the congregation, for instance, partnered with some of the black congregations in Durham, for instance, and sometimes actually all went there when we don't have all the lockdowns and social distancing and all that, just go into another church to worship with them on a Sunday, and suddenly you have 50, 60 white people just turn up, and worship with this congregation and become friends with them and actually do things that actually break down barriers. Those are the sort of things that I think are called for in some of what's happening today, where we actually go out of our comfort zone and do more. All right, I think I should pause for comments at this point.
Michael, good morning. This is Robin. I'm glad to see you and everyone. So I don't want to give us an excuse by reminding folks of what I think is true, and that is that we are not fighting with flesh only, that there are powers and principalities at work in this. And so to watch and to learn from what occurred in South Africa, where the church was deeply involved in the reconciliation of the predominant racial populations there, is an absolute template for how I think this could happen in North America. And that because we have to bring all of our tools and resources, and not just our own intellect or emotional capacity or our PhDs or our good hearts or our good cheer. All of those things will be necessary, but I think we need to recognize that we're fighting against strongholds. I also want to echo what you said earlier. I love your application of culture eats strategy for breakfast into this context, Michael, because I think it really boils down to an essence of something. We have to appreciate the difference, and we have to recognize that there are beautiful ways. Daffodils don't act like fir trees, right? Daffodils and fir trees are completely different, but they're both plants. And so as Americans, we're different from one another. And as a woman as a young girl who grew up in metropolitan New York, who came to Chapel Hill to go to college and then fell in love with a Southerner, I can assure you that there are vast differences between the Southern mindset, particularly the female Southern mindset, and what I grew up with as an Italian New Yorker. And so it is not only racial. We have to embrace our cultures, and we have to remember that there's beauty in that, right? So this is so well done, Michael. I just love knowing you. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. That's very kind. I appreciate the point, especially also about the fact that even among white Americans, white Americans are not homogeneous. When you hear that talk about racism, sometimes you get the impression that we're talking about this homogeneous block of people who think and behave the same. It is not true at all. I mean, in all my travels around the world, the only place where I've seen anything that came close to a homogeneous society is in Korea. You know, and that is not because it's intentional. It's only because Korea, up to the end of the 19th century, was a completely closed country, really, to the outside world. And so they opened up bit by bit. And so you don't find, and the other factors like their language is not easy to learn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So whites having settled or foreigners having settled in huge numbers in Korea, that's the closest I've come to seeing a homogeneous society. No society is homogeneous, whether black or white, you know, in any country. And I think that the diversity is there and we should recognize it and celebrate it and work with it. Any others?
And I guess to not take my own advice from earlier, as a generalization, we have the impression that Korea may be among the Eastern cultures where the society as a whole is valued over the individual, or there's more emphasis on subjugating yourself to the group. And, you know, America, many people celebrate the rugged individualism and, you know, I've got to be different to stand out. So, and that leads to less homogeneity among American cultures than many people expect. Whether, you know, the obvious elephant in this conversation is blacks who recently came from Jamaica or Haiti have a very different culture than descendants of enslaved peoples from Africa. So again, we can't jump to conclusions.
Thank you, Nelson. I think that's also very important to note, yes. I want to leave time for a bit of discussion, but let me just show 2 more slides and then I'll leave the floor open. And actually what I'm going to show is about an American figure I deeply admire, Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so I've read I've read some of his speeches and I've listened to them and I've thought, wow, you know, this is just such a great man, you know, and he clearly was very spiritual, and he was also deeply aware of divine justice and everything, and the way he lived and the way he operated seemed to reflect that. So in his second inaugural address, he said this, and he was talking about, this was in the middle of the Civil War was still going on, you know, and he was talking about, I mean, my question when I read this, what I think about is, whose side is God on? You know, with all the divisions we have in America today, with be it racial, religious, political, whatever, whose side is God really on? Is God on the side of the liberals or the conservatives? You know, what's the story here? So Lincoln had this to say, each, and he was talking about North and South, each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God for assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And then he ends with this famous quote, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the rights, as God gives us to see the rights, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to achieve and cherish a lasting peace among ourselves and with, sorry, I should stop. Okay, to achieve and cherish a lasting peace among ourselves and with the world, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So when I think about this, I'm thinking, whose side is God really on? What Lincoln was saying is, God is not on anybody's side necessarily. God is on the side of the rights. God is on the side of justice. God is on the side of love and no malice. God is on the side of all of us looking for what is right and actually working for that and to bring it to pass in our society. So I thought I would end on that. At this point, I'll leave it all up for any more questions and discussion.
Hi, Michael. Wonderful job. This is Regina. And what I'm thinking about when Abraham Lincoln, I had read those speeches too, but when he was writing that particular speech, he was thinking about when the angel of God came to Joshua and the man of God stood before Joshua, and Joshua wanted to know whose side, whose side are you on? Yeah. And the angel of God, who was representing Jesus Christ, said neither. Just like you said, he's on his own side. And so the goal here is for us to be on his side. And the Lord is so good to us as the body of Christ. He's given us his Holy Spirit, who helps us to walk this out, because this will be a continuing work until the master returns. So we're given a good charge, but we're given the power and the hope of the Holy Spirit to help us walk through that. And Jesus showed that so much when he talked with the woman at the well, and he told her that the Lord is looking for, God is looking for true worshipers, those that will worship him in spirit and in truth. And worship has to do with our everyday walking it out in this mundane, hard task that we are given. But he's not left us alone, and never will he leave us alone. So thank you for a great job, Michael, in saying all that you said and researched that information, looking from it from another eye, not from the American eye, but from another vantage point. So I thank you for that.
Thank you too. Thank you very much, Regina.
Good job, Mike.
Thank you. Let me stop sharing because I think I want to see people's faces. So Dr. Landau is joined us again today. He was on 2 weeks ago. And one thing he said that day that's actually blessed me a lot was, he said, we need a pastoral approach to racism in this country, I mean, to our situation. He said it in passing, but for me, that summed up a lot of what he said that day. He was talking about dreams and not racism, but it helped me a lot. And I think that pastoral approach is where the church can excel on, where we as Christians can actually do a great deal to help the American context and to help to change the narrative and where we are going as a country. And all of us, by the way, I mean, when we say pastoral, we're not talking about Carol, we're talking about Christians, we're talking about the church. All of us, God has called us as priests. I mean, if you read the book of 2 Peter, is it 1st or 2 Peter? 1 Peter chapter 2, I think. I didn't prepare for this, but I'm just remembering off the top of my head. In 1 Peter 2, Peter talks about the fact that we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood. We are all called to be priests in God's, priests of God, actually. And we all have a role to play as a church. I mean, it's not only down to our minister. So, Dr. Landau, do you have any comments to add to all this, please?
Well, Michael, thank you. I was really taken by and inspired by your reflection, and it evoked for me many memories from my work in the Middle East, where also Jews can have contempt for other Jews and Arabs for other Arabs. It is not just a simple bifurcated dynamic there or anywhere else. When you were talking about truth and reconciliation, and I've looked into that a lot in terms of a model for peace building and healing, the example of Archbishop Tutu and other religious leaders, we definitely need that in the United States, in Israel, Palestine, and in other places with endemic conflict that's been seething for so long, and generations have been conditioned to see things in an us versus them binary perspective. The last thing I want to say is, when you were talking about giving other people the benefit of the doubt, okay, I think a spiritual way of saying the same thing was taught to me by a Palestinian Catholic priest, Abuna Raed Abu Sakhlia, who said that he has cultivated the spiritual practice of preemptive forgiveness. So before he goes to a checkpoint, either on the Jordanian border or at Ben Gurion Airport, and he expects to be harassed and humiliated by security personnel who've been trained to treat people rather cold-heartedly, sadly, he expects this and tries to cultivate and emanate an attitude of forgiveness, what he calls preemptive forgiveness. So since we don't know what we don't know about other cultures, we should expect to have these huge blind spots in our perception and in our feelings, in our hearts as well as our minds. And we have to form young people to be more compassionate, empathetic, and accepting not just of difference, but of the different ways people deal with pain and loss and grief. And too often grief hardens into grievance, and then we're stuck even for generations. And if we don't get underneath the grievance and see where people are in pain and fear, we'll never make any breakthroughs. So that's my reflection. Thank you, Michael, for everything. And to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 1 minute before the official time is up. Any more comments? Oh, Kelly raised a question. Oh, Nell, just a minute and I'll let you talk. Sure. He raised a question about people are not connected to religion or their religion is less loving. How to reach them besides, for example, there's a quote that is attributed to St. Francis. I don't know if it's true or not, that it's he said it. But when I was trained as a preacher in England, one of the things I learned was preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. Okay, just be a loving person, just be a forgiving person, be someone who is just always reaching out. People from just looking at you will say there's something different here, you know, and without even preaching at them, that can make a big difference. Now, did you want to say something, please?
I want to say thank you. I like the entire morning has been very insightful and healing and positive and informative, and I think I love the truth and authenticity that you bring to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Thank you.
You mentioned in passing when you were preaching in Britain that frequently it was a very segregated congregation. Are there examples that you found elsewhere where the people who gather for worship reflect the cultural mix of the surrounding community?
Let me just correct slightly. In Britain, it wasn't so much as a segregated congregation. Actually, you didn't feel any difference. If you walked into a church, you were fine in general. I mean, and Brits are generally very polite. So even if they were not comfortable with you, no one will be rude to you. I remember preaching in one particular service where after I finished preaching, so it was in November like this. So Remembrance Sunday, when we remember all the wars and everything. And one white lady walked up to me after the service and said, I didn't understand a word you preached. Mm-hmm. And a few minutes later, another young white man came up to me and said, that was such an excellent sermon. Yeah, so what do you do with that? You know, same congregation, same people heard the same service, the sermon, and they and so I just laugh at things like that because it was very funny, you know? And then you move on. And another thing that's interesting is that the British church has been on a decline for a long time. Okay. Right now, one of the things they are doing is actually going out and inviting people from other cultures to come in to bring about revival. You know, and I think that's a very positive thing. So, and places like Korea and all that, I remember going to Kentucky once and went to a Korean church, and the pastor after the service said, when he learned I'd been living in Korea, said, oh, Koreans are so racist. And I was taken aback, and I said, I didn't see any of that. Because they loved me to bits. You know, I'm in a Christian community, and they just loved me. And I didn't see any racism at all. And I went to the university to study Korean and all that. I didn't see racism, you know. So perception can mean a lot of things, and it's hard for me to put a finger on something. You know, the Christian experience is rich, and I think God blesses us with that ability to love genuinely, and we should go for that. I have to jump off the call because in 10 minutes I'll be helping to lead the service at Duke Chapel. So
thank Michael for
Thank you, Michael.
and
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To your anecdote about the lady saying she didn't understand a word you said.
Yeah.
There are people who speak in the local vernacular who get that feedback because the listener doesn't want to hear what's being said or they don't understand the theology. So,
bye, everyone. Thank you, and have a blessed Sunday.
You too, Michael. Thank you very much. Very enlightening. We need more.
come back next week. Another Divinity School intern will be leading us, Nathaniel Metz. Many of you know him from Bible study. And if you thought today's topic was a stumbling block, listen to his plan for next week. Christ, the terror from beyond space. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's view on Christ as a stumbling block. See you then.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.